but we are very also excited, and we want to welcome Jeff Halper to the program. Jeff, thank you so much for being able to join us. We're gonna have you come up and speak next. And as a quick introduction
Okay.
for Jeff, Jeff is an Israeli American anthropologist, an activist living in the West Bank since 1973, and Jeff is going to uncover some of the powerful relations that make it possible for Israel to get away with this genocide. So I'm going to hand it right over now to Jeff Halper.
Well, thanks for having me. Uh, just so you know, it's 3 o'clock in the morning here. So it just proves how much I value this invitation to speak to you all. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you so much for being up so late, early. I don't even know which one it would which one it would be. Appreciate you doing that.
Yeah, it's 3 a.m. here, but all right. Well, and you can hear me okay, right? Everything's fine.
You sound great. Yeah, you sound great to me.
Okay. All right, good. All right. Well, how long do I have, by the way, in the
That's
to speak?
20 minutes or so.
Okay,
That's
all right, great. Well, sitting here in Jerusalem, uh, I'm kind of in the belly of the beast in terms of Israel, what we're doing to the Palestinians, and of course, relations to the United States. The United States is sort of the puppeteer in a lot of this. And one of the questions that I know we're asking in this webinar is, in a way, how does Israel get away with it? That's how I begin my book. I wrote a book called War Against the People: Israel, the Palestinians, and Global Pacification, in which I tried to trace out um, uh, what I was really trying to trace out, in a sense, was, well, it would trace out in a way, but I was trying to look at the global capitalist system and its enforcement, and in a sense, um, as the neoliberal system becomes more and more exclusive, more and more people are excluded from it. Not only the 85% of humanity in the global South that are considered surplus humanity, basically, that will never be educated, will never be brought into the capitalist system, will never become consumers, and so on, and therefore are excluded. More and more, the system, of course, is excluding people in the global North as well, especially the young generation. Uh, and as it becomes more exclusive, as we have these income disparities, as resources become scarcer and scarcer and flow to fewer and fewer people, and as the world begins to burn up, and of course you begin to have patterns of migration, and then you have issues of control and trying to exclude other people from from the resources that you have, and you have concepts like Fortress Europe begin to develop, and so on. The whole capitalist system becomes more and more repressive. And I think until the mid-70s, 80s, when this neoliberal phase, this predatory phase of global capitalism really kicked in, capitalism was it was growing still. There were new markets. The third world had just begun to emerge, out of colonialism. There were new markets, and capitalism could have a nicer face. Ronald McDonald and Disney movies and so on. But certainly in the last few decades, as it has become more repressive, as markets, in a sense, have been saturated already, the system has nowhere to go. It's beginning to implode. Um, the whole issue of enforcement becomes all the more key. And all of a sudden, behind the smiley face of Ronald McDonald is a pretty scary caricature of cruelty and um, and so and so I was sort of looking at that, and I thought Israel would be uh, a very good way to get at it because for a couple of reasons. One is that it's not a superpower. I mean, it's very easy to look at the United States, for example, and trace out how the United States feeds obviously, into the global military system and into the system of enforcement. But in some ways, the United States is sort of too powerful. The picture is too obvious because the United States has the Pentagon. It has $1 trillion a year budget. It has all these weapons. But in many ways, the United States is much more geared, the American military industry is much more geared towards conventional warfare, towards fending off major competitors like Russia at one point, China today, maybe the upcoming BRICS alliance of global South nations and so on. So the arsenal of the Pentagon is really more of an arsenal of conventional warfare. But when you're looking at enforcing capitalism, it has to go much deeper than that because you have to be protecting and controlling sources of resources. You have to be supporting what Marx would call comprador elites. In other words, elites in what we would call third world countries today who don't have much power themselves on a global sense, but are geopolitically in important places, like Afghanistan, for example, or who sit on important resources, and a lot of the most valuable resources in the world. Michael Clare writes about this in his books on resource wars, where he's claiming that almost all wars today are really genuinely resource wars. Those kinds of sometimes small countries and repressive countries that nevertheless sit on very valuable resources. Maybe the Congo is one of the major examples of that. Well, in that kind of a situation, in a truly global sense, where you're not just looking at the big powers, but you're looking at more detailed, more focused sources of control, American weaponry doesn't help very much. I mean, you could see it in Afghanistan and Iraq and places where the American weaponry is just, it's too big. You can't really control people. And you can't do that fine details kind of control with F-35s or nuclear missiles or a lot of the heavy armor and the heavy weaponry that the United States has. And that's where Israel comes in. To circle back in a sense, that's where Israel became very interesting for me because Israel plays this very pivotal role. That on the one hand, it has the military sophistication to produce, high-tech weaponry systems and so on. But on the other hand, because it's been engaged in a century-long war with the Palestinians, it's really tuned its weaponry and its tactics of control and its tactics of population control and its strategies of surveillance and strategies of really of policing on a long-term basis, not coming into a war, being in a war for a year or two or three and then leaving, but having to stay for a century and with no end in sight. So being able to keep that up, to keep the control and so on, Israel has really developed those weapons of control again, for what I call wars against the people that the United States, Europe lacks. And I think Russia as well. I think you see in Iraq, in the Ukraine as well, that Russia is using conventional war tactics in what in many ways, is a war against the Ukrainian people. So that's where Israel becomes very useful. And then, what I find out, what I kind of ask to sort of sharpen things in my book is, how does Israel get away with it? And then as I began to kind of put the pieces together, Israel's experience with the Palestinians, Israel's the type of weaponry and tactics that Israel has produced. Where does Israel fit in terms of its global reach? Because Israel, in many ways, it's hard. I'm exaggerating to some degree, but it says something that in many ways Israel has a greater global reach in terms of just not just military, but again, surveillance, population control, policing, than the United States has. The United States has something like bases in like 174 countries, according to Chalmers Johnson. And there's 193 countries in the world, so that's not a bad global reach, except the United States, again, is based on conventional warfare. So you have military bases, but the bases are fairly self-contained. You think of a military base, you have the weaponry there, you've got the barracks, you have the McDonald's on the base and so on, and then you fly out or you sail out or you move out for some operation, and then you return. So you have global reach, but it's kind of shallow in a sense. And again, it's based on a certain kind of, even almost a superficial engagement with another army. Israel, to tell you the truth, Israel only has two bases, both in Muslim countries, which is very interesting. One of Israel's bases is in Azerbaijan, which has really, and now, Israel is the hero country in Azerbaijan, because in their war with Armenia, in which they took a good part of this region of Armenia that kind of is nestled in Azerbaijan, Armenia has used Israeli drones. Azerbaijan has become one of the major laboratories for Israeli drone development and drone warfare on the Armenians. Azerbaijan is also the place where Israel sends most of its missiles, surveillance missiles, spy missiles, into space. But Azerbaijan, of course, is a jump-off place to Iran. And so in a sense, Israel is kind of a surrogate. Israel has its own interests in threatening Iran, but obviously in this bigger geopolitical situation we're in today, where you're almost at the cusp of an American-Iranian war, and where you see very clearly where Israel and Israel and the United States plan operations and carry out operations against Iranian targets. In Iran, that's where Israel does most of the work. It's inside Iran. But of course, just like we saw this week, with the Iranian surrogates in Iraq and Syria and Lebanon and elsewhere. So that's one base. The other base is in Eritrea, which is probably, if not the most repressive, one of the most repressive countries in the world, Eritrea. And there again, it's very interesting that it's very close to the Houthis. It's close to that part of the Middle East and so on. So, but my point isn't that really. My point is that Israel has relations militarily, but again, not just militarily, in terms of training your presidential elite and your police forces, and of course, securing your local corporations and securing foreign corporations working in these countries that can be very dangerous for foreign business people. Israel has a presence there that the United States does not have. I don't think Americans have ever heard of Eritrea. I don't think Americans know where Equatorial Guinea is, which is one of the richest oil countries, and again, one of the most repressive countries in West Africa. A lot of countries that Americans have no interest in, but Israel is there. Israel, in my view, is in more than 174 countries. Israel's in countries that on the surface it's at war with. or has no relationships with. And so Israel really plays a double role in the world system. On the one hand, it acts as a surrogate for the bigger power, especially for I mean, Israel is obviously aligned more with NATO than with other countries. But at the same time, we have to really understand that Israel is not merely a client of the United States or NATO in general. You know, Israel, it turns out, is the #2 arms supplier to China after Russia. Israel's the #2 arms supplier to India after Russia. You know, and not only are they supplying weaponry, it's not so much weaponry that Israel supplies to China, for example, because the United States does control to some degree, to a complete degree, the weapons, the export of weapons. But Israel's able to bypass a lot by exporting technology. Some of the technologies that have developed itself based on American technology, or other technologies the Americans allow, or dual technology, and so on. So Israel sends systems components or surveillance. I mean, here China and Israel are very, very strong in terms of developing this massive surveillance system that China has, that it uses, for example, against the Uyghurs. So that what I'm saying is that Israel has a niche in terms of working with the bigger powers in the world, not only in controlling their own populations. You know, the United States has a very, Israel has a very strong system of training the American police, for example. There's a big center in Atlanta at Georgia State. That's called the Galil Center. Gali Center or something. The Georgia, it's something like the Georgia Center for Legal Exchange, whatever. You know, so in other words, it works on the military level, but deeper down in countries. So on the one hand, again, Israel works with the bigger powers in the world, but on the other, you know, in terms of geopolitics, global geopolitics, but on the other hand, because it's got that depth in its military security relations with countries, it also works through repressive regimes in controlling their own populations. That's where Israel becomes very strong with Saudi Arabia. You know, that's why Saudi Arabia said to Israel this week, you know, don't worry about the Palestinians. You know, we don't need you to commit to a two-state solution or to dealing with the Palestinian issue, wherever. No, it's okay. We, the Saudis, we want to go back to normalization. I mean, the Saudi street is seething with anger against Israel. The whole Arab world, the peoples, are seething with anger, the outrage of what Israel's doing to the Palestinians in Gaza and beyond Gaza, of course. But the governments, I mean, the governments are getting all this, you know, not only the weaponry to protect themselves, let's say, against Iran, or for their regional geopolitics, but weaponry to control their own populations, because these are very autocratic governments. So Saudi Arabia is really saying to Israel, all we need from you is a promise that you will, you know, at some stage begin to consider a two-state solution with the Palestinians. In other words, it's really nothing. So that's the power, in a sense. That's where Israel became more useful to trace in the global system than the United States, because of that whole issue of control. And that's really how Israel gets away with it. Because in that sense, what I'm saying is that Israel doesn't only have the support of the United States for the work it does for the United States or for NATO. I mean, now NATO's talking about a Middle East NATO, led by Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Israel. So Israel is really crucial, not only for NATO itself, but for, again, these autocratic regimes, pro-Western regimes in the region. But Israel also has, again, this niche of enforcement that allows it to work with China, to work with the BRICS countries, and to work with repressive regimes all over the world, whatever their ideological orientation is. So that's, in a sense, where Israel is. And one of the ways that it does that, just to finish up with this piece of it, is that, you have to look at the Palestinian. I write about this quite a bit. You have to look at the Palestinian occupied areas, the West Bank, and of course Gaza, as a laboratory. I mean, what country in the world has a laboratory that in which it can do anything it wants to on the Palestinians, even though it's been accused of genocide? That's not at all holding Israel back in any way. In the light of day, it doesn't care, because Israel knows it's never going to be sanctioned, because the United States has the veto in the Security Council. So it's not going to be sanctioned, and so it doesn't really care, and so it has a laboratory that it can do anything with. And with that laboratory, then, of course, as we can see in Gaza, there's all kinds of technologies that are used for the first time. I mean, this time we've got drone systems of Elbit that have been used that aren't even off the assembly line hardly, that are being used in Gaza today. You have new laser technologies. It's very useful for Israel that Hamas is throwing these missiles, and also Hezbollah in the north. I mean, they are doing, they're not doing a lot of damage. They have displaced Israelis. So, I mean, I'm not saying that it's a great thing in that sense, but it's a great thing in the laboratory sense, because Israel is now developing a laser, not only the Iron Dome system and systems of protecting, Israel from missile attacks that it's exporting everywhere. But now it's developing, and we see it now with Gaza, laser systems of intercepting missiles. And lasers have never really they're there, but they've never been made operational. And they're not quite operational. Israel says in another year or so. But again, you see the laboratory that they have here. So maybe I'll leave it at that. I'm not sure. I don't have my watch on
No,
how
thank
close
you.
to 20 minutes I am, but that kind of gives us an idea of where Israel would fit in.
Yeah, Jeff, thank you very much. I think, very, very interesting analysis that you have brought us here tonight. And it's so important for us to understand how Israel and the US fit in together, and, some of these other players as well. So really, really appreciate what you have brought up for us tonight.